Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a great weekend. The weather didn't turn quite as warm as any of us had probably hoped, but I made my trek back to Michigan, and I'll be here through the week if you need to talk to me for any reason. Just a couple of comments. I really enjoyed our Friday session. I don't know if anybody else did, but I had fun. But it kind of goes to show you, and I mentioned this in an email I sent out to you guys because I was pretty pumped when I left there, because some of the ideas that came up in that room, as weird as they were, and some of them were pretty far out there, they really did, with some refinement, come back with some things that could potentially be done to really protect students and faculty in schools. I mean, there's no question that some of those ideas, the little junior KGB guys come to mind, right? It's really far-fetched, and it's not going to happen. But you could take that idea and you could say, are we going to potentially train some of the teachers in a preschool to be, super protectors, if you will, right? Every one of them gets the same level of this is what you do if a kid, somebody tries to take a kid, and this is what you do and who you call and those kinds of things. But is it in the best interest of a preschool to train some teachers in hand-to-hand combat, in self-defense, in better ways to identify potential perpetrators? That's what could come from that. You had these super agents, right, that were going to do something, but perhaps you could refine that idea into super agents of, just well-trained people that are trained above the rest in that school, and they have additional responsibilities for additional pay to perhaps employ those protective service kind of skills that they've been trained in. So, I think let's not get lost in the fact that, we had some pretty wild ideas. Let's, kind of celebrate the fact that we could take some of those ideas and, as wild as they were to start, it's easier to dial them down. And that's one of the things we're going to do in our homework this week is the same type of drill. And I know you guys are probably saying, wow, we've done this type of drill before, the whole threats and assets and vulnerabilities and sensitivities, but it's a tried and true method, and you're applying it to security for all different types of venues. And eventually, you're going to be able to use that same type of thing to apply, and many of you, to your cybersecurity protections. To say, what am I really protecting, right? Why am I protecting it? What could go wrong? What makes it so vulnerable? And then, I could just put, you have to put in your password every 10 seconds in order to get to it, and the password always changes. But nobody's going to let you do that, so that's a sensitivity, obviously. So the same methodology applies to any type of proactive protection, and in this case, we're going to apply it to transportation and cargo security this week. So let's start with the numbers, because we really need to put this in perspective just like we did with everything else. And this is probably the largest one, monetarily wise, that we'll discuss this term. Because 55.2 million tons of goods are transported just in the U.S. every day. And the U.S. is the largest economy, but it is certainly not a majority. It may be a plurality of product movement, but it is not a majority. When you put all the rest of the countries together, we are just a percentage, and not a 50% of the things being moved around the globe. But 55.2 million tons, that's $54 billion a day in goods moving in the U.S., and that only counts things moving on rail, truck, and air cargo. Okay? That's movement within the U.S. When we talk about what's really moving, a lot of things, as we know, come from foreign countries and come by ship. It is probably the largest amount. So the 54 billion each day is only product moving within the United States on conveyances that we can see. So that's an amazing number. And if you look around you right now, put it in perspective. Look around and tell me something in your view that didn't get shipped to you in some way. Now, you may have brought it from home, right? If you're in your dorm room and there's a TV in your room, well, I brought that from home, yes, and it was shipped from somewhere to the store where you or your parents or someone else bought it, and then you bought it secondhand, and it was moved then again. But everything that you have at some point was in the commercial shipping lane, unless you grew it yourself or mined it yourself out of the ground. So think of it that way. Look around. Even the walls, the doors, everything that you have goes through some type of transportation. any tangible item. And so the security of these items and the movement of these items is huge to commercial security and to private security professionals. So where and how do these things move? Well, the primary one is ports, and we're talking about ports as in seaports. Okay? And all international shipping imports come in through shipping. Well, there's a small amount that comes in by air, and we'll talk about that, but the vast majority comes in by sea. And most ports in the United States are privately owned. Therefore, they provide the security for the port. Now, we have the Coast Guard that provides security for those ships as they move across and into our waters, right? And we have Merchant Marine who do the same. But for the most part, the security at a port belongs to the port owner, and those port owners are generally private corporations. When people think about the port of Los Angeles and the port of Newark, some of the bigger ones, Charleston, Miami, the port facilities there are generally privately owned. They may have several private owners of different sections of the port, and they all may have their own security and differences in how they do things. Now think about those containers. They come in from certain places, and sometimes, say, a car company says, I'm going to get a shipment of fenders made in Korea. I have a Kia manufacturing plant, an assembly plant in South Carolina, and I need fenders. Those fenders are stamped in a plant in South Korea, and they come in. Now, I have storage at my manufacturing space for 1,000 fenders, but it is cheaper for them in the factory in South Korea to make them 10,000 at a time, to stack them in containers, and to ship them that way. So the port in South Korea may hang on to those particular fenders for some time. Those containers may sit, and they pay a small storage fee for those to sit at the port until they are ready to put that container onto the back of a flatbed truck and drive it to South Carolina. So say it came in at Charleston, and it's sitting there, and the people in upstate South Carolina, where the plants are, say, okay, we'll take it on next Tuesday. They've been sitting there for 2 weeks, and on Monday, they get loaded onto a flatbed truck and driven overnight. In the morning, Tuesday morning, they are there just in time to put on new Kias. But there's an old saying in security that product at rest is product at risk. It is very hard for you to steal something from a moving truck, a moving train, a moving boat. But when that product sits for any length of time, it becomes vulnerable. And in the case of seaports, products may sit for sometimes a month or more at a time before they get shipped to where they need to go. And that is by design, because the receiver may not be ready for it when it gets there. And it's also very hard to time a boat, right? You believe it's going to leave Korea on Tuesday. You can't say 2 weeks from today it's going to pull in to Charleston. You can estimate that. But there are a number of things that could happen. The ship must stop to refuel. When it stops to refuel, it could go through a customs inspection by the country it stops to refuel in. It could refuel on the water, but the fuel didn't get there on time, or they had to wait in line and it took an extra day. They could have to drop off and pick up more crew somewhere. That may slow them down, so you really can't say exactly what it's going to be. So generally, all product sits at the port for some amount of time, and while it's sitting there, it is definitely at risk. Now, you're all familiar with airports. I'm sure you've been in and out of airports, most of you anyway. There are 19,453, as of yesterday, airports in the United States, and 5,155 are publicly owned and operated. So consider the fact that there are 14,000 roughly private airports in the U.S. Those are generally a single airstrip. May even be some farmer has an airstrip attached to his farmland, and 1 or 2 planes locally, or even just the one that belongs to that farmer, they happen to be an aviator, that is considered an airport. They must register it as such, and that's part of that 19,000. But the 5,000, those could be as small as Grove City Airport, not too far from campus, or as large as O'Hare or Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, the world's busiest airport. But 8 million people fly each day around the globe. You figure 8 million, and if you think about the fact that generally an aircraft, even going internationally, will hold, on average, probably 150 to 175 passengers, because you've got those small ones that go from, the city hoppers that have 27 passengers like an Embraer, and then you have the big A330s that holds, 350 people, I guess. So if you think about it, 8 million, that's still an awful lot of air going on. But 50 million tons of cargo is transported every year in the holds of those planes. Okay. And some of that cargo, and we're only talking about the legal shipments, by the way, because we all know there are illegal things that go by air as well. But some of that cargo may surprise you, and we'll talk about the air cargo in a second. But I just want to tease that up a little bit, because one of the things when I first started in this business surprised me what's transported on airplanes. Let's think about the threats a little bit. And when we talked about schools and when we talked about retail, in retail, we talked about theft. Not primarily, though. We actually kind of focused in on violent acts at the mall and in stores. But I think that was really just to kind of get you in the right frame of mind about the importance of private security in those instances. But when we talk about transportation, our number one threat is going to be pilferage and theft, right? But there could also be a crime of delay. If I have a particular company, let's just say, we'll use Kia as the example because this one's kind of out there because it's so big it wouldn't happen necessarily this way. But let's just say the folks at Toyota don't want Kia to have those 10,000 vendors they were waiting for, right? Let's delay it a little bit. Let's pay somebody at the port to bury that container or lose it for a little while, or maybe just not ship it for a week or two and send ours to us first so we can get more cars on the lot. When people go shopping at their local car lots around the U.S., there's lots of Toyotas in inventory to choose from, and there's only a few Kias, and therefore people would rather go find where they have choices, right, and go buy that. And that comes really from kickbacks. And kickbacks in general are very prevalent in transportation. In a lot of foreign countries, it's almost a cost of doing business, and you can almost see it on their balance sheet. It's so prevalent that you try to manipulate the shipping of others' goods and your own so that yours go quicker and people want your stuff. Now, counterfeit goods, another huge issue. I will tell you that, when you go to New York City and you buy your Rolex watch and your Chanel purse and your Louis Vuitton bag, and you buy it down on Canal Street, it's not real. It's counterfeit. And there are lots of counterfeit goods that are made in countries for low cost. So, a Louis Vuitton bag is supposedly made in France, but instead the ones that you buy on Canal Street are made normally in Vietnam or Cambodia for very cheap, because the labor is very cheap, and shipped in, marked as something else in a shipping container, hidden in shipping containers, and brought in and sold in the United States at a discounted rate, but still far more than it costs to produce them, certainly far less than the cost of the original, because you're buying it for a logo more than anything else. And for the most part, the money that is generated from the sale of counterfeit goods in the United States is used to support terrorism, and that's been proven time and time again by professionals following the money. And then, of course, we have human trafficking, which is certainly a problem in the United States, mostly associated, by the way, with the trucking industry, because you're moving people and you want to move them fast. You need to move them overland and get them into major cities. Trains get inspected more so than trucks, and therefore the trucking industry is a unfortunate high-volume participant in human trafficking. So those were our general threats with the transportation of goods industry in general. But ports themselves have their own list of threats, natural disasters not being the least of them, because by design a port is on the coast. And when you are on the coast near the ocean, you have things like hurricanes and tidal waves, tsunamis, all those types of things. There's certainly the opportunity for man-made disasters and accidents when you're moving so much in goods and you've got such a crowded port, there's so much activity, and it is moving very large containers, very large heavy containers. You have the possibility of accidents, and that is definitely a threat, more so a safety than a security one. The importing and exporting of illegal goods, certainly drugs, counterfeits, stolen property, all going through ports. If they're coming in from another country and they were stolen, they're coming through a port. That's just a fact. Generally speaking, you will not find stolen and counterfeit goods being brought into airports as much, certainly not the commercial airports and non-commercial airliners, because the manifests are checked so well because of the terrorism threat. You have organized crime pilferage, not uncommon for people who work security at the ports to be bribed to let people come in and take things out of containers. They don't take the whole container. They just take things out of the container and reseal them. And it's very hard then to determine where something was stolen until it gets to its final destination and the inventory doesn't add up. Now, if something is stolen from a port, it is generally acceptable to file an insurance claim. If it is damaged in the shipment or it's missing, the receiver will file for insurance. But if they overorder or don't really want something once they've ordered it, it would not be uncommon to pay someone to damage that in shipping, so that when it is received by you, you can say, I received it damaged, I'd like to file a claim, and therefore back out of a sale that you'd already agreed to, and the person who really gets stuck is the sender. Terrorism is definitely an issue when it comes to containers. How hard would it be to bring in a container loaded with something that could do us harm? Explosive, biological, chemical, even nuclear. The containers are large. There's a lot of them. They're moving across the sea, and for the right price, someone may put a container on a ship without it being checked. And then we have diversion of goods. Now, diversion of goods, let me explain how that works. Companies sell their own products for much different prices in different parts of the world. Same product, different price. For instance, you've heard me talk about razor blades. Company I worked for at one time had a division that was Schick razor blades. And we could sell 5 Schick razor blades, right? The disposable razors. 5 of them in the US in a package, and you would spend about $6, $7 when you went into the store to buy those. That same package in a shipment that was going to Mexico would go on rail, go across in Texas into Mexico, be unloaded on the Mexican side of the border, and it would be marked for the Mexican market, and that same exact packet would sell for the U.S. equivalent of about 70 cents. Why? Because the economy in Mexico could not handle $7 worth of razor, but it would handle 70 cents. The economies were just different. There was less disposable income, less income per person. Therefore, if you wanted to sell your product, you sold it cheaper. Were we making a profit? Sure, because when you make those things and once you get it down to a process and you're making them, they are pennies to make. But you sell them in each market based on what people are willing to pay. That's supply and demand. The diversion happens when they go across the border at Mexico and are unloaded on the Mexican side for the Mexican market, but they load them into a truck and drive them right back across the border and sell them in Texas and adjoining states. Or load them right back onto rail and ship them to New York or New Jersey or California and sell them in the black market for $6, whereas they go very quickly because most people are paying $7. So diversion of goods basically is a very high profit margin kind of a thing. It's buying in one country and one economy and selling in another where you can sell for more. And you avoid all of the taxes on that product as well. So you are making a huge profit, tax-free. But before you get any ideas about how that's going to make your living, it is definitely illegal. Now, national cargo theft volumes are going to rise by the end of 2024 and have proven to do so now that those stats are in by 35%. National cargo theft way up. Problem is very prominent in California, which saw 48%. So, in this analysis, unlike some of our others, Philly is off the hook. Nobody dies, so Philly's off the hook. But very prominent in California. And let's face it, many goods come through California. They have more seaports than any other state, at least in numbers. And so if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. Electronics are the number one item being stolen. Now, you could say that, okay, that could be someone working at the port. Could have been stolen while it was moved from one point to another. Could be when it's on the truck and in movement. Maybe it didn't get stolen at the port. The issue is that we're not talking about, one TV. We're talking about container loads. That is an organized crime thing. You must have the resources available, the network available for bribing and being able to move that type of equipment and those sizes and volumes of products. So organized crime at ports is a big problem. It has been a big problem for decades. I don't know that it's something that is ever going to really be controlled. When you've got that much product in one place, it is very hard to control it. That in and of itself is a vulnerability. You've got so much product in one place, and you can only protect to a certain degree. I think that, when you're talking about vulnerabilities, you may be considering the volume of goods at our ports. Now, airports are a little different because their main concern, their main threat is terrorism. Why? Because we have a history of terrorists using aircraft, as we know, as weapons and weapons of mass destruction if they can. Now, political hijackings were a big thing in the 60s and 70s. We had a long string of planes being hijacked and taken to Cuba by people who were communist sympathizers, and they thought they were doing something special for Castro and for the Kremlin. And so they would hijack planes to Cuba, and then we would pay to get them back. But that has slowed down some of the political hijackings in that regard, where you're stealing the aircraft, essentially, has slowed way down. But terrorism is still the major concern. Now, on dedicated flights to those smaller airports, obviously drug movements. There is no question that a good portion of the drugs that come in to the country, although we hear about drugs being smuggled across the southern border, the majority of drugs that are lower volume, like something like fentanyl, right? Whereas, if you're moving marijuana, you need to move it in bales, right? It takes up some space. Whereas fentanyl, cocaine, heroin take up less space. Those are moved generally by aircraft coming into small private airports in coastal cities and coastal areas. One of the threats that people don't talk about as much at airports is threats to the staff and crew. Travelers can become very agitated, much like disgruntled employees we talked about in retail, and even disgruntled faculty and students when we talk about in schools. You do have the issue of people who become agitated when their flight is canceled, their seat is changed, any number of reasons. But threats made towards staff and crew is on the rise, and it is not very uncommon, as uncommon as you might think. And then, of course, there's the theft of high-value shipments. Under the aircraft where you sit is the cargo hold, and it's not just your luggage down there. I will tell you there are a couple things in there that might surprise you. The first one that might surprise you is that there's very likely in an aircraft that you are on a coffin. Someone's remains being moved from one place to another. They die in one place and they want to be buried in the place where they grew up or where they lived before they retired, or any number of reasons. Those bodies are generally moved on passenger aircraft in the hold. You won't see them be unloaded. They get unloaded a little later on after all your luggage is off. Someone comes out with the cargo, and it's wrapped in a wooden crate, right? The coffin is inside. You can't really tell what it is, but generally that is how those bodies are moved. The other one is cash. And when I talk about movements of cash, I'm talking about movements of large amounts of cash. When cash is exchanged from one currency to another, generally speaking, US dollars for euros, euros for yen, any number of different types of currencies, at some point those currencies must move back to their original place or to the place where they are needed. We have people who come in with euros into the U.S. for vacation, exchange them for dollars, and then we have a plethora of euros, and eventually the banks that do that exchange, and they always charge a fee for the exchange, and it's usually a healthy fee, but eventually they want those euros to be exchanged back for dollars that they can use in their own business. And so at some point, currencies need to return to their original issuer and country of issuance and be exchanged back for the currency that's used in the country where they were spent. So it's not unusual to find pallets of euros or dollars or yen or pesos or whatever type of currency on airliners. That is the preferred method of moving them, is on passenger aircraft. They are shrink wrapped, put on pallets, and put underneath planes. Now, it's not every plane, but some planes have a fair amount, and normally international flights will have some cash in the hold underneath, being moved from a bank to a bank or from a central bank to a central bank for that reason. Now, one of the more prominent cases just to show you how much money could be on there. In 2013, now that's been some time, $1.2 million was taken from the tens of millions that a Swiss bank was transferring in the cargo section of a plane. Okay, and the case was never solved. So they have a pretty good handle on the cash when they put it in, and they have a pretty good handle when it comes off, but there are people on the plane. Crew members can go from upstairs to downstairs into the cargo hold. There is a hatch to go down there. And unfortunately, in this particular case, although the case was never solved, somebody moving that cash onto the aircraft took $1.2 million worth. But just remember that when you talk about passenger aircraft, the cargo that's underneath it is usually a lot less stuff, but the stuff that's on it usually has a much higher value. It costs a lot more to move cargo that way than it is to put it on a ship or on a cargo plane. Passenger aircraft take off every hour, get to a place, and you can get something to across the country in 5 hours. You're going to pay dearly for that. You don't want to put just toys and small appliances on there. You're going to move things like cash and pharmaceuticals and precious metals. Now, a lot of things in the United States are still moved by rail, and there are corridors that are really hot for rail. Arizona, to California and New Mexico through that corridor, and then over to Dallas and Memphis. Memphis is a big city overall for cargo, both on rail, ship, and trucking. And the reason is that you have rail that goes through there to feed the other two. And you can go down the Mississippi River at Memphis and be out through New Orleans and out to the ocean, out to the Gulf, or up the Mississippi and all the way through into Canada that way from Memphis. The other thing about Memphis that's important to remember is that is the headquarters and the main hub for FedEx. And FedEx moves a lot of commercial goods. So when you talk about, from Arizona to California through New Mexico over to Dallas, Fort Worth, makes sense. Big cities all the way through California and Dallas, Fort Worth, big areas. But Memphis is a huge area to consider when you talk about cargo. And the hottest item taken in the last few years have been Nikes. I don't know why the brand, but Nike shoes. And the CEO of CSX, which is our largest rail cargo company in the United States, it's first after Wells. Is it Wells Fargo? You'll have to give me a minute, and I will think of who the Union Pacific. I'm sorry. Their CEO talked about how you could have a train with 100 cars, 100 containers, and organized crime rings will know exactly which box has the Nikes or a particular type of appliance or car, whatever they want to take. And they're going to go directly to that car when that train stops somewhere and take the things out of it. They know exactly where to go. And when investigators went back to try to figure out some of these cases, in one particular Nike case, they found more than 1,100 text messages and calls between the people who robbed the train and a person registered to a Nike employee in Memphis working in the distribution. So it is definitely an organized crime kind of thing where you infiltrate the company itself, the people who are loading the train cars, who are giving you information for a fee as to which train car. Because if you've ever sat waiting for a train to go, in some cases, when a train's going in front of you and you're sitting in your car waiting at a crossroad, it may take 10, 15 minutes for some of those trains to go. How would you know what is in each one? They're not labeled. And the way they know is that somebody is paid on the inside to tell them where it is. And that is how organized crime works. Now, CSX has invested millions of dollars on fencing, gates, cameras, all kinds of things to protect as best they can, but they still have this type of loss. So we know we have lots of assets. Almost everything around you has been shipped to you in some fashion. So everything that's tangible is an asset, including cash, right? And we know what the threats are now. We've looked at several, the different types, even from natural disasters to organized crime to crimes of opportunity, all kinds of terrorism, all kinds of things that could threaten our transportation system. But let's talk about vulnerabilities. And one of the main ones is that if something is being shipped, its value is assumed. Now, Now, if you think about shipping something by rail or by air or by sea, it's not cheap. So you know in those containers that there is something of some value. If something has such little value, you're going to send it, as cheap as you can, and you're not going to invest in, putting it on a train. You're going to put it in a truck, period, or you're not going to ship it at all. It's not worth it, right? If the cost of shipment's too high, nobody's going to buy the product. You don't really have a product. So thieves assume that there is a value to a shipment just by the virtue of it being a shipment, right? You got large amounts in single areas, whether they be truck depots, rail depots, or ports, airports. You know that you've got lots of stuff in one place. It is gathered and it is sitting and it is waiting. It is product at rest, therefore it is product at risk. These are open areas. There's a great deal of activity. Watch the tarmac at an airport, one of the most secure places in the world, because you don't want people wandering around. There's still a lot of activity and things moving everywhere. When things are going so quick and there's so much confusion and there's so much stuff in such a big open area, there is an opportunity in that case for theft and other activities. And you don't have to take the whole thing. When you go into a store to steal, to shoplift, there are 20 of an item on a shelf and you take one or you take two. You're leaving a gap on that shelf. Someone may see you. There's a lot of people around. When you're at a port, someone's job is to touch those things, to move them and to take them. And if you're just moving a few things, there are containers of these things. No one really even thinks twice when somebody's got a forklift full of pallets. It's got a big pallet full of electronics on a forklift, and they're moving it from point A to point B. If you tried doing that, in a store, everyone would know you're doing it. You do it on a dock, it's somebody's job to do that just about every minute of every day. So you don't have to take the whole thing. You can still make a profit, and moving the product is just something you do for a living. Therefore, it's not unusual for you to have large amounts of new items that don't belong to you in transit because your job is to move them. Now, there were certainly going to be sensitivities as well. If you're running a company and you're shipping goods, if you are Nike, you want your tennis shoes, your trainers to get from the factory, usually overseas, right? I think many of them are made in Vietnam, and many are made in Cambodia, Malaysia, and in China because of the cost of labor. You need your trainers to get to the Nike store. They don't do you any good while they're sitting at the port. They don't do you any good while they're in the box at the factory waiting to be shipped. They only do you good when they are sitting in the store and there's someone willing to trade their hard-earned cash for your shoes, right? That's when you really make your money. So you need to have ease of movement. You need it to be fast. You need it to be, as smooth as possible. No interruptions. Some goods may have an expiry date. Certainly agricultural goods. Tropical fruits and vegetables coming out of Latin America will spoil very quickly in a dark container. A lot of fruits and vegetables, especially those tropicals, they ripen more in the dark. So if you've got them in a shipping container, you need to move those and move them quick. So you can't slow down. There are international laws. So when you're moving from one place to another, you can't just lock these things up and put a chain around them and seal the container and say, nobody open this until it gets to, if it's moving from, say, China to the United States, no one may open this container until it gets to the United States. That's great in theory, unless that ship needs to stop to pick up some goods in the Philippines, because the Philippines customs agents have full right to open anything on that ship once it arrives at their port without a warrant. And when a ship may stop on the way, may stop in, say, Midway or in Hawaii even, and it hits that port, the officials at that port can open any container, and they will make spot checks on containers before it gets to its final destination, say the port of Los Angeles. International laws and nuances, the lock types, open access for customs inspections, and you also have to consider bribery at any of those points. That's a sensitivity. You know that there are so many places where people can open that container and you can't stop them. And of course, you need to keep the cost down. Now, if we try to say, okay, we're going to put cameras inside of every shipping container, and we're going to we'll put an armed guard inside of every shipping container, and we'll put a little sleeper in there, and give him a little area to live inside. You could actually do that. They're about the size of a house trailer, most of them, right? But you're giving up shipping space, and you got to pay a person. Cost is everything when it comes to moving these goods. They want to move them efficiently, fast, little interruption, and as cheap as possible. Those are sensitivities you cannot get around. So you really have to watch all of those things and others that you may think of. So finally, we're going to come to mitigations, as we always do. Now let's look at a common mitigation, just to give you some idea, right? Locks. Very simple device, right? Been around since the days of the Egyptians. I mean, the first locks were certainly BC. They're used on trucks and trailers and shipping containers all over the place, which means that the most common theft tool used in cargo theft are bolt cutters. Not guns, as in retail, right? You've got violent crime, you've got all kinds of weapons. Your weapon of choice when it comes to cargo, it's normally theft. That's your biggest threat. And bolt cutters are the most common tool. And in fact, now we're evolving to new threats like battery-operated grinders. Battery-operated tools have been around for some time, but they really, especially grinders, it uses a lot of energy to cut metal like a lock. And so one of those grinders would only last for a couple of minutes. But as we know, battery technology has gotten better. And so locks have had to get better to kind of keep up with that type of thing. So for instance, you may see this at many older shipping yards where, people are waiting to hook up. This is a cargo container that's going to go on top of a truck, right? And on the back here, right here in the middle, just a chain and a lock, plain old padlock. Been used forever, and that really was cargo security for the longest time, but it's pretty easy to defeat. So we get a little bit better. We make a lock where the hasp is protected. As you see these collars, and this is titanium on the outside here, much harder to cut with bolt cutters. You could still potentially get a bolt cutter down in here, but you're not going to get it over in here. There's just a very, very small area where you might be able to get access, and that's a heck of a cut there. This is much tougher to cut, so you'd need to have a cutting tool here rather than just bolt cutters, just because of the simple way that they've modified locks to try to mitigate that risk. Even when they didn't want to go that far, this is a cylindrical lock. Now, when you turn the key and the lock will go one direction or another. This hasp goes back into the housing. The beauty of this is that you must cut it in two places. If I cut it in one place, it's not going to move. It's still one piece. I have to cut it here and on the other side as well to get that off of there, right? I have to have two cutouts, one on each side of the hasp, in order to take the lock off. So it just doubles the work. Now, this is much cheaper than the last one I showed you with the titanium on it, but these are used, you'll see these a lot in storage lockers. If you have a storage locker, you may have one of these. Very common to buy now. They cost about double the cost of a padlock, but it takes twice as much effort to break into them, and the professional thief will look at that and potentially say, I'll go to a standard padlock. It'll take me less time, and I have less chance of getting caught. Now, in this particular case, I'm looking at this one, and I can't quite understand, because that certainly does look like a standard Phillips screw there. I don't know what it's screwed into, but with enough pressure, it seems to me like you could just take the whole hasp off the rig here. I'm not quite sure how this is hooked into here, whether it's flat and riveted on the back, but I just don't understand the fact that it looks like standard screws on this, that it would come off. But nonetheless, this particular lock gives you a little bit better security than a padlock. And finally, we have another type of lock that's relatively new. This one locks the two bars that hold the trailer doors in place. That move, it holds them in place. Very hard to cut. You definitely need a cutting tool, and it's going to take time. These are all delay factors. You want to be able to detect, deny, delay, and defend your cargo. This will delay someone from stealing from it because it's very hard to cut through. So just innovation in locking devices are the mitigations that are applied just to trucks. And this is a technology, right? It's rudimentary technology. It's certainly not high tech. But as we go through and look for mitigations, we're going to be looking for more high tech mitigations to some of the bigger threats that are out there on some of the other types of cargo movements. And one of those might be drones. Now, drones are very cost effective. They're expensive, sure, to buy, but you can cover a large area with a drone. Someone could tamper or disable it, right? A drone is very much a bird. If someone wants to use a shotgun to take down a drone, if it's down low enough and going around a train yard where it needs to be relatively low, you're not going to fly that thing at 3,000-4,000 feet. You're going to be going between train cars looking for people in movement. It's going to be close enough to the ground, and they are for the most part reactive. You're going to see something going on, but it's not going to stop it from going on at that point. The drone is not equipped with attack capabilities, and by law cannot be. Only military drones can do that. So they aren't going to stop any type of crime or any type of threat, but they certainly will detect it. And we do have some evidence to show that they work fairly well. Now, this particular drone in the picture here was used in Poland in 2014. It was one of the first times drones were used by a rail company to try to protect cargo. The first half of 2024, PKP, which is the company that put them in place in Poland, reported the number of thefts along its rail decreased by 44% just because the drones were there. There was a deterrent effect. When people saw the drones, they decided that there's a chance they might get caught. Now, in 2014, that doesn't sound like all that long ago, but if you think about it, drone technology was very new then. People really didn't think about drones the way they do now. People have drones as hobbies these days, right? Many of you may own drones and fly them just for fun. It's not uncommon. But in 2014, especially in Poland, you would not find people who were flying drones for fun. And, it's a bit of the unknown. We don't quite know what the capability is. Therefore, we're not going to challenge the capability. And the value of the stolen goods went down because they flew them in the right place around areas where they had higher value cargo. Naturally, you want to protect the stuff that's worth more. The value of stolen goods decreased by 59% during that same time period. So why don't we use it more in the U.S.? and try to stop the theft of those Nike sneakers? Well, the reason is that the FAA requires that when you use a drone in a commercial application for security, you have a spotter. Someone has to be within eyesight distance of that drone at all times. They can fly the drone, but they have to be able to put their own eyes on the drone itself. You can't just fly a drone around from a remote location and set it down for commercial purposes. Right? The military can do that. Police departments can do that. The average commercial user cannot do that. And if you're going to have someone who has to watch the drone, why not just have them out doing the patrol themselves? You're paying them anyway. Really, the drone just became an extra expense. And even though it would probably give you a better view, one of those sensitivities was definitely cost. And we're adding to cost if we have to have both the person and the drone. And so our rail companies have opted for people rather than drones just to keep the cost down. So the government intervention and regulations in this case makes your technology a little less effective by regulation. So when we opt for people, who are these people? Well, we have railway police. The railway police are common in many countries. They were formed to protect rail workers actually in the 1800s from attacks from everything from Native Americans to people who wanted to rob them because they were just a crime of opportunity. The jurisdiction is set near rail lines and rail yards, and they have full investigative powers. There have been a lot of controversy, and I think we may have talked about this at the beginning of the semester with the rail police, and we'll talk about them again the last week of the semester. We're going to revisit the reputational issues in security, and we're going to apply our methodology to solve that problem that we first discussed. But the railway police have been around forever, but they are quite controversial because of their methods of dealing with people, often violently. Now we have the TSA, right? After the 9/11 attacks, the TSA was formed, and private security in airports was dialed way back. There are still private security officers in many airports, but they don't screen passengers, and they don't screen for weapons and items that would do harm to people in the air or on the ground. So government took back control to improve the quality and standardize the practices. And then we also have the Federal Air Marshal Service, which puts people on aircraft to prevent crimes in the air, including terrorism and hijacking. And there are 45,000 flights daily in the U.S., and there are 3,000 air marshals. If you figure that at any particular time, if there are 3,000 of them, that means there are probably about 9,000 or less, in fact, about 800 that are on duty at any particular time. So we're not making a huge saturation into those 45,000 daily flights, but it is still, the Federal Air Marshal Service is still out there, and it's likely that when you are on a commercial aircraft, somebody sitting, usually in the first class cabin, was a federal air marshal who is there for your own protection. And then we have the transit police. New York City has the MTA police. They have 1,200 people dedicated to transportation and transportation security, be it the airports, the seaports, the airport, the rail and bus lines in New York City, and they cover everything outside of federal control. So we do have a dedicated group of people just for security in transportation. And unfortunately, we can't use some of that technology that we talked about, like drones, which would be a great opportunity. Robots are kind of the same way. They would just get destroyed in those environments. So we supplant it with people, and we have people dedicated to do that. And we have other standard mitigations, container seals. When a container is locked, a seal goes on, and you can tell when someone went in. It's usually a numbered seal of some kind. It can be as simple as just that, a numbered plastic seal that when the seal is broken, you can't replace it. But there are also metal ones that have certain devices on them that electronically will tell you if they've been tampered with. GPS systems that go into the containers themselves, so we see if the container goes off track. Used very much now in the trucking industry. Truck drivers have a route. There are companies that dedicate themselves to watching truck movements across the United States, and they just simply put a parameter around that truck. It's going to go on this route. It should be here by this time. If it doesn't meet that parameter, an alarm goes in, and they call the driver to get a better location to understand what's going on with the route. They check manifests along the routes to make sure that things that were put on the plane or on the ship in China, let's say, when they stopped in the Philippines, that they're still there. They check the manifest to make sure it's there. You see motor carrier police along the highways that will stop and check trucking manifests to make sure they are carrying what they say they're carrying, that the seals have not been tampered with and those things. And then you have maritime enforcement. The U.S. Coast Guard does that same type of getting onto ships and checking the manifest and starting to go through and doing spot checks to make sure the cargo is still intact and no one's tampered with it. But those are standard mitigations, and you can use some of those when we do our assignment this week, but you're also going to use some of your brain power like we did on Friday. So you know the drill. We're going to identify assets, threats, vulnerabilities, sensitivities, and then decide on some mitigations. And this is specifically how I'd like you to do that this week. You will pick a transport method. You can pick rail, seaports, airports, or trucking. It doesn't have to be one you know a lot about. In fact, in some ways, it may be better to pick one that you don't know much about because you'll have an open mind as to what you could do to fix it. And I want you to go through that asset, threat, vulnerability, sensitivity matrix like we did. And when you pick an asset, I want you to pick a specific asset. Don't just say, goods on, going through an airport. Don't just say, goods on a train. I want you to pick something specific. Laptop computers, handbags, cars, leather goods, clothing, pharmaceuticals, foodstuffs, anything you want to pick, but be specific because I want your mitigations to be specific if you can, at least one of them, around that particular asset that you're protecting. So if you're talking about, I pick airports and I pick pharmaceuticals. They are moved on commercial aircraft quite a bit. There are some pharmaceuticals that have to go from factory to a hospital very quickly. For emergency situations, they go on commercial aircraft, and ironically, when they get to the airport, somebody puts them in a taxi and they're taken to a hospital that way. That's the general way that they're done. Or an ambulance. And you could pick that. But pick a very specific asset once you've picked a transport method. Then I want you to list the vulnerabilities. Explain what about that vulnerability makes that asset vulnerable in the transportation method that you selected. Does air travel, does putting something on an aircraft, is it more vulnerable because it may not be on nonstop flight? If the flight has to stop and then it has to move from one plane to another, if I'm trying to get something from Pittsburgh to Iowa City, Iowa, it's not going to go direct. There is not a direct flight from Pittsburgh Airport to Iowa City. It's going to go probably to Detroit or Chicago and sit for a little while and then put it on another plane and get there. I would say a vulnerability in that case would be a nonstop flight. But there are lots of vulnerabilities that you need to think of. What could make the product vulnerable while it's in that particular mode of transport going from point A to point B? Then list the sensitivities, right? You could put some over-the-top type things, security measures, and probably make sure that nothing goes wrong. When we're moving Nike sneakers on a train, you could put those sneakers onto somebody's feet, right? You're going to move 100 boxes of shoes. You're going to hire 100 people to wear those shoes and to have a seat on the train and lock them in and give them all the food and drink they want along the way and let them watch movies and make them very comfortable. And then when they get there, take the shoes off. And you're probably going to get them there. But cost-wise and practicality-wise, you're going to fill that train car with people rather than shoes, and it's going to cost you a lot of money. So those are sensitivities. You have to be sensitive to the fact that it's got to be fast, it's got to be smooth, it's got to be cost-effective, and you have to put in reasonable protections and expect that people are going to look at the things as they go along, that there are going to be delays. So all of those are sensitivities, and I want you to list those. And then finally, I want you to list 3 mitigations. And I want you to test those against your vulnerabilities and sensitivities. You're going to list a mitigation. This is what I would do to better protect that product on this particular method of transportation. And then make sure that it's in line with the vulnerabilities and the sensitivities. So if you tell me a sensitivity is cost, and then you tell me you're going to put an arm guard on every pair of Nikes, I would tell you that your mitigation would work, but it certainly doesn't match your sensitivity. So do that litmus test. Now, you're going to list 3 mitigations, and 2 of them can be standard. You could do one standard, you could do no standard, but I'll give you 2 of them that are, as we called them, Charlie Brown teacher fixes. Yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But I want one that's cutting edge. I want it out of the box, high-tech thinking, and make it good. Now, we did some crazy ones in class. I want you to dial them back ever so slightly, but I still want you to go cutting edge. As creative as you can be a way to protect those things. I want you to post this by Thursday at 11:59 p.m. That's just before midnight. And then before Sunday, respond to 2 classmates before midnight on Sunday. And in your response, I want you to give them an idea how to refine that cutting edge idea. They have a cutting edge idea. They've come up with a kind of a bit of a wild child out of the box thinking how to do something. Use that idea. And usually you'll need to dial it back, but you could dial it up a little bit. Say, well, okay, I like that idea, but what if we did this to it or did that with it? And I want you to refine their idea so that we come closer to a cutting-edge new way to mitigate these risks, or mitigate these threats, rather. So with that, if you have questions, I am, like I said, home in Michigan, but you know how to reach me. I have office hours Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 11 to 11:50. When I'm on campus, I do that in my office. Otherwise, I do it on Zoom, and the Zoom address is in the syllabus. If you can't find it, text me, call me, send me an email, and I'll send it to you. If you have questions, we can visit then. If not, I'm looking forward to reading those on Thursday. By the time we meet next week, I will tell you who the winners are of our Get Out of the Spring Doldrums contest. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do for the rest of the semester and talk about how we're going to wrap it up with a bang. I look forward to seeing you on campus next week. If you have questions, get a hold of me. Have a great week.